the behaviors are often repeated. It's the same over and over, right? They just kind of rough play, versus real fighting where perhaps they're usually not friends. And then bullying where typically, again, they're not friends and it's generally repeated. We want to look at that balance of power as well. What does that look like? Is there an intent to do harm? Are we really playing, right? Or is there real intent to harm the other person or persons? What is the affect like? Is there clearly one or more students in distress? They are not having fun, right? Is it aggressive? Is it tense? A hostile situation? And here it looks very clear cut. But the problem is that kids can go back and forth, right? Today, we're friends and we're just rough playing, but tomorrow, I really want to hurt you because you've offended me. And then in a month, we may be back to friends. Or it may develop into a pattern of behavior where now we've established an imbalance of power, and now I really am bullying you over time. So it does require our sort of investigative eyes, right? I say that you guys, as educators, you're always like detectives on the side because you're always trying to find clues and are always thinking, and you know, right? And you can sort of always think about, okay, well, those girls were tight before, right? Like they were really good friends, and now I'm seeing that one or two of them have not been around, they've kept their distance, something is going on, right? You're so good at that because you know your kids, right? And so consider what that could be. So I'm going to get into some of the risk factors and effects for students who are involved in bullying. And so we're going to talk about children who are bullied. We're going to talk about children who display bullying behaviors. I'm going to talk briefly about children who both are bullied, are targeted, and display bullying behaviors as well. And then we want to make sure that we talk about our bystander students, which we want to actually turn into upstanders, right? We don't want them to just be bystanders, we want them to be upstanders. So again, I want to preface this section by saying that this is not a profile. This is what we've learned from the research and the data, right? And so in no way am I saying that if your child or your students have any of these characteristics, that they either are bullied or they're going to be, right? This is just what the data and the research tells us. So what we know is that children who are bullied tend to be cautious, sensitive, quiet, more withdrawn. They feel anxious, insecure. They tend to report lower self-esteem. For boys, they tend to be physically weaker than their peers. And for our girls, they physically mature earlier than their peers, and then have few peer friends, right? They tend to, they like to be with the teacher at lunchtime. They kind of crowd around the lunch supervisor or the yard supervisor during breaks. They'd rather be with adults than have their own friends. They really relate more with adults than they do with their peers. And you guys know this, right? These are the effects of some of our youth that are targeted. Again, lower self-esteem, depression, anxiety, absenteeism, and lowered school achievement. Unfortunately, thoughts of suicide and illness. I always appreciate when I have someone in healthcare, you know, particularly our school nurses, because they can speak to this so well, right? And they talk about sort of their frequent flyers, like those students that are in the office every day at the same time, right? Like right before PE, right before break, when they have to start being around other students. You know, and somehow every day at the same time, they've got a stomach ache, right? Or they have a headache. And maybe initially they don't, but over time, they can become real physical symptoms, right? That anxiety, that sort of feeling, nauseous and feeling like, my God, I don't know what awaits me out there, can produce those physical symptoms for our youth. And typically that's the youth that we see, coming to the office or opting out of certain class periods or times. We recently worked with a high school who they were having a big issue with a lot of students checking themselves out at lunch and or not returning after lunch. And so what happened is that after they really dug into their data and really started to ask the students and the families what was going on, they realized that they had almost 600 students out at the same time. And what was happening is that students were getting a lot of anxiety and stress about, where are we going to hang out? Am I going to see my friends? Am I going to be able to meet them? The lunch line is 45 minutes long and I'm out there by myself without my friends because it takes us so long to find each other, and there's too much pressure. And so we started to think about, well, what are some options that we could create for students to really work on that anxiety and that stress? Because that is a huge, unfortunately, huge part of students' lives. And not just students. I have an increase of just reports and inquiries regarding adults dealing with trauma and anxiety and stress and PTSD and all kind of things. And so we think about, well, how are we able to serve our students when we're dealing with our own stuff? How do we equip our teachers, our classified staff, who are tasked with such a big job when they're dealing with their own stuff, right? So really important to consider that as well. So again, children who display bullying behavior. So now these are the students, and notice that, we always want to be mindful of our language, right? We never want to say, the bully, right? We don't want to label kids in that way. And so we're going to talk about children who display aggressive or bullying behaviors. These youth tend to have positive attitudes toward violence. They tend to be impulsive or quick-tempered. They show little empathy. They tend to be involved in other antisocial behaviors, and I'm going to get into those in a bit. They tend to be physically stronger than their peers as well. And then we have to consider, what is the motivation around that, right? And some of you mentioned that when we talked about some of our own assumptions and ideas and notions around bullying. And so what the data also tells us is that sometimes these youth like to dominate others in a negative way. They gain satisfaction from inflicting injury or pain and suffering onto others. And somehow they receive rewards, right, by bullying others, right? Prestige, somebody said attention, right? Because what happens among kids when you sort of show that strength, right, in that way, you get that attention. Whether it's negative or positive, doesn't matter, right? The idea is that you're getting that attention. The concerns about children who display bullying behaviors are many. And this is what I like to share with parents. When it comes time to, you wouldn't believe the amount of adults that I still encounter who say, bullying is not that big a deal. Like, I went through it, and everybody goes through it, and I'm fine, that kind of thing, right? Where we still have this idea that it's not a big deal, right? And so I like to share this with them, particularly when it is your child who's displaying the bullying behaviors. And that's hard as a teacher. How do you talk to parents about, this is what your son or daughter has been exhibiting in school? So children who display bullying behaviors or children who bully others are more likely to get into frequent fights, to be injured in those fights, to steal, vandalize property. They're more likely to drink alcohol or smoke or try other drugs, to be truant, to drop out of school. They report academic achievement. They perceive a negative climate at school. And this is a big one. They're more likely to carry a weapon. And that's very serious, right? But that's what the data tells us. We also know that bullying can be part of a more serious conduct disorder behavior pattern, right? That if it goes unchecked, can go well into adulthood, right? Which is so important, why we really catch these behaviors at a young age. This study, I particularly, and I'm sorry I didn't link the website where you can find the full report on this, but this is a study that was done by this organization. And what they found was that youth who bullied in middle school were 4 times as likely to have 3 or more convictions by the age of 24. So that is really telling. If I was a parent sitting in a conference room with my child's teacher and they told me that, I would be in shock. I would be alarmed at what this could lead to, right? And again, we don't want to scare people into, well, this is what can happen. But just something to consider, right? Because this is data, right? This is research that has happened out there. Any questions about children who display bullying behaviors? So, children who are targeted but also display bullying behaviors, it really is a whole nother presentation. I have a whole nother training just on this particular population, because it is a really complex issue. So again, these are children who get targeted, but also display bullying behaviors. So these children attempt to bully others, but tend to be less impactful, right? They tend to not be as successful, for a lack of a better word, in bullying or harassing other students. They behave in ways that cause irritation and attract negative attention. And usually I always have people like nodding like, oh, we know, we can think about students who display these kinds of behaviors, right? Other kids don't want to be around them, right? And so they try to sort of attack or bully other students, but then they just end up getting targeted, right? And so it's this like battle, right? And the concern is that these students really require more intense, comprehensive interventions. That is what we would call some of our students who we can identify as needing a tier 3 support, right? They need a wrap-around support. They need a behavior support plan. They need the social worker involved. We have our parents involved, right? That's who we're talking about here. So I want to talk, because it's really important to talk about our bystander students. And I want to start by talking about some of the effects of our bystander population. So these students, again, these are students, what we mean by bystanders is our students who they don't display bullying behaviors and they're not targeted either, right? They kind of just watch what happens in their environments. And these students may feel afraid, right? They feel powerless to change the situation. They feel guilty for not acting. And over time, they have diminished empathy for the student that's being bullied. Why do you think that is? That over time, these students might just lose some of that empathy. Yeah.
Because they see the child continue to allow it to happen without speaking up or saying anything. It's kind of, I don't know the term of it, but someone was being, I think it's the bystander effect, where you see this lady was being beat and then
Yeah. Yes.
or raped, or you say that.
Yeah.
And no one called 911 because they were just all looking around. So there has to
It's this deflection of responsibility, right? And there's also, because you mentioned they see that the student isn't doing anything to stop it, but more importantly, they're not seeing adults intervene. And so now I'm afraid because And I've conducted hundreds of interviews with children from 3 years old to late teens. And I've heard over and over again, well, he or she's been bullied since the first grade, so they must deserve it. I hear that all the time, right? So there's this diminished empathy because they don't see adults intervene. Yes?
I wonder if it's also a way to kind of deal with the guilt for not acting, the feelings for that. You kind of suppress that, and so you don't really have to feel guilty anymore if you feel like that student. You don't really have to empathize with the student.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think there's a huge piece too where kids go home and they tell their parents, and their parents aren't telling the principals or saying what's happening.
Yeah, there's a breakdown in communication, right? And that's also a really good reminder that when I talk to youth, they always say, you know, because one of the things we tell kids is, you know, tell an adult at home and tell an adult at school. But if they don't have a trusted adult in neither one of those environments, then we lose that communication, right? Because maybe they're telling their teacher who they do trust, but they're not telling anyone at home, right? Or they do trust someone at home, but no one at school. They don't have that one trusted adult. Did you want to add to that?
I was going to say there's some kids that might even go home and tell their parents that so-and-so is, you know, being mean to this other kid, or they want to hurt them or beat them up. There's a lot of that, but parents aren't reporting. Like, it's almost like the kids are telling their parents to be like, can you say something for me that someone else is? And then when the parents don't, then kids don't know what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the other thing. There's this huge phenomenon around how over time students tend to identify themselves with the students that display the bullying behaviors rather than with the student that's being bullied. And as you can imagine, why would you want to identify yourself with the student who's being bullied, right? Because in their eyes, that person is weak, right? So of course, I would rather identify myself with the student or students who are displaying the bullying behaviors because they might be perceived as stronger, have more social capital, right? Maybe they're more popular, and that's a whole nother phenomenon, right? For a while, I studied this idea of like popularity and why kids want to be popular, and time again, kids say, you know, oh, you know, popular kids are mean and they're nasty and they're this and they're that. And when I ask the question about, then why do we want to be popular? Kids say, because I'd rather be somebody than be nobody. And don't we all? Right? But it's when we don't have those healthy ways of really reaching out and really being able to choose our friends wisely and to really have our own, be our own person, right? When we don't help them navigate through that, that it becomes more cloudy for them, right? And that's what they say. I'd rather be somebody than be nobody. And so that means sometimes identifying with what we know at our core we don't believe in or we don't respect, but we just want to be noticed, right? And that's what we all want. So that's some of the effects on our bystanders. This is like a 30-minute activity on its own that I'm going to try to just go through briefly in our presentation. If there's anything you take back to your school sites that you share with another person, it's this bullying circle. Yes?
I wonder when we're talking about telling adults, telling a parent, or telling a teacher, an adult at the school, I wonder how many of those adults really have this buy-in that we have to like treat this bullying situations in a certain way. And some people are kind of a little bit dismissive because it's the easier route. And if they send out those little subtle messages to the students that, oh, we'll just ignore it and we'll just let the bully win. So nobody, you know, there might be a lot of adults that aren't really addressing the issue. They're going the easy way out.
That's such a good point. And you know, in any work that I do, whether it's restorative practices, bullying prevention, PBI, you know, everything that I have a part in, I always talk about we have to start with the adults. We have to. We have to model the behaviors and the language that we want youth to use. Kids are so smart. When I was a counselor in schools, I used to run upstander groups. And so these groups were for students who they neither targeted other students and they didn't get targeted themselves. These were students who just needed that extra boost of motivation to really be upstanders within their school community. And we would talk about things like the difference between being assertive and being aggressive. It would blow their mind. Like there's such a thing as, like I can show people I mean business and I don't have to get in your space. I don't have to use violence, right? We actually had to teach that. We would talk about, I mentioned popularity, a variety of topics. And youth, you know, they're very open and they're very honest. And they would tell me, Miss Patty, you know, there's a lesson on like rumors and what that does. And they would tell me, Miss Patty, I hear my parents talk about my teachers all the time. I hear parents when we're waiting in the line, when we're at, you know, events at school, I hear them talking about, oh, and did you hear about so-and-so? And they would tell me the things that they would hear their parents talk about. And so I would have to say very honestly, you know, we're not perfect. We're not perfect. And we need help too sometimes. And sometimes you guys can teach us something too. Right? Because we have to acknowledge that as adults, we don't always say the right things, right? Or use the right behaviors or the right language, right? And so in many ways, I was glad that they're calling out their parents and they're saying like, what, you know, like that's not cool. Like, why are you talking about my teacher or whatever it is, right? In a respectful way. So when we talk about a pretty typical bullying situation, we often think of it as sort of this straight, you know, two-way street. You know, there's a student that's being targeted and there's a student that's displaying the bullying behaviors. But often we forget about all the other players involved. And so let's sort of unpack this a little bit. So in the middle here we have H, who is our student who is being targeted. Right? This is our student that's exposed, our student who's being targeted in some way. When we start here on the left circle, we have A, right? Which is our students who start the bullying and they take an active part. Then we move to B, which is our followers. They take an active part, but they didn't necessarily start the bullying. And if you can believe this, just a few years ago, followers, instead of followers, they had the word henchmen in there. It was awful, yes. So we changed that. The developers of the program changed that. But they did it in a way to sort of give you an idea, really, of who B was, right? And we've got C. These are our supporters, right? These are our students who support the bullying, but don't necessarily take an active part. Right? They're kind of watching what's going on. They might be videotaping things, right? An incident. D are our passive supporters. These are our students who like the bullying, but they don't display any open support because somehow deep down they know it's wrong, but they still somehow like it. Then we move down to E. These are our disengaged onlookers. These are our students who they just kind of watch what happens and don't take a stand. Or students who just are kind of oblivious to what's going on. They're kind of in their own world, like none of my business, like I'm just doing my own thing, right? Then as we move to the right of the circle, we've got F. These are our possible defenders. These are students who dislike the bullying and they know that they ought to help, but don't do it. Why do you think that is? Why do our Fs not intervene?
They don't want to be bullied by the bully.
They don't want to be the next target. Who does, right? Why else? Low self-esteem. And remember when we talked about some of the feelings of our bystanders, right? That guilt, right? Or they feel powerless to help the situation. Like, what can I do? Right? Like, I'm just one person, right? What can I do? And then as we move all the way up here, we have our Gs, our defenders. These are our students who dislike the bullying and they help or try to help the bullied student. Like, these are students who are like, this is not cool and it just makes me sick. And you cannot do that to my friend, or you cannot do that. Like, here at our school, we don't do that. Right? These are the students that I talked about my upstander groups. These are the students that were in that group that we tried to engage, to really give them tools to be able to intervene. And sometimes it's still unsuccessful. Sometimes they still end up being the target and they don't care. Because it's worse to have that feeling of ugliness, of I can't stand it for someone to be picked on in that way, than to just let it happen. The good news is that I've worked in many schools and the data tells us that in any given school, most of your kids are Fs and Gs. They are. There are more, because obviously the idea is to get our students from the left side to the right side. And the good news is you already have most of them on this side. What happens is, because sometimes I get calls from schools who are like, Patty, we need your help. Like, bullying is just like off the chain. Like, it's just happening a lot. Like, we need your help. And the first thing I might ask is, well, what does your data tell you? Are you tracking these incidents? Is it truly bullying? Because what happens is when we start to really dive into your incident reports, your office discipline referrals, whatever data you have, it's really that you don't have a system for addressing unwanted behaviors. And sure, you may have isolated issues or incidents of bullying that just seem amplified because of who it's coming from. Does that make sense? Like, it's the student that he's been in trouble since first grade, he's been doing this, for a long time, and the level of how severe the incidents are keeps going up, and so it just amplifies everything. And it feels like you have this climate of bullying when we really drill down, it's really like 4 or 5 students. But it just seems so amplified because of the severity of the incidents. Does that make sense? And that doesn't mean that you don't need help or that we can't support you. But really what I'm going to say is, let's look at your data and then let's look at your system. Let's look at, PBIS. Is it that you need a tier 1 refresher? Do we need to really solidify the core features of PBIS? Do you have clear expectations for your students? Do you have clear expectations for parents? Do they know what your core values are as a school? Let's start there, right? Any questions about this circle? When I do this in a full 2-day training, I actually have adults and we role play and we get into these roles. And there hasn't been one time, I've not done this once, where somebody doesn't get really emotional, because it brings back a lot of memories from your own school days and how it felt to be on either side of this circle. But sometimes we need to feel that so that we sort of get an idea of what our youth are going through. We're reminded of that for sure. Any questions about the circle? So I started our time together talking about how, bullying is not just a youth issue, right? It's a people issue, right? And so we need to consider adult bullying behaviors as well. And I do have to say again that just in the last year or so, I've had mainly requests and inquiries about adult bullying, about helping school sites deal with bullying, but with adults. So there's a need. We've identified a need, and it's neither good nor bad, it just is. It's where we are. And so we need to consider, bullying behaviors, from, unfortunately, teachers to students, teacher to teacher, among parents, administrators, community members and administrators, right? I've been to some pretty contentious school board meetings, right? So we need to definitely apply the behaviors, right, and that support, that tiered support to adults as well. And I don't think I didn't add that slide, but we need to be able to support adults on that tiered approach as well, right? And really, but in order to do that, we need to really have our core values solidified. Because if we don't know what they are, if we're kind of like wishy-washy on what we believe in or what we stand for or our vision for our school site, then we don't know what to tell each other as adults, much less students. So again, being very mindful of whatever we're putting in our handbooks, however we're revising our policies, that we're not just talking about students, that we're talking about everyone in this school community, right? And in particular, when we do say all students, that we mean all students, that we mean our students that may have a disability, our students that participate in migrant education, our transient community, right? All of our students, very important. Unfortunately, bullying sometimes crosses legal lines. And there currently are no federal laws that address bullying specifically, but there are state laws that address bullying specifically. This website here, stopbullying.gov, I use it all the time. It usually always has updated data and information. I use it all the time. And there's a section in there where you can familiarize yourself with our own California laws that affect bullying. And it also talks about Title IX, right? And like violating students' civil rights. But basically what I wanted to highlight here is that in 2010, the US Department of Education for Civil Rights issued a Dear Colleague letter. On stopbullying.gov, you can see the full version of that memo. But basically what this letter said is that school districts may be violating students' federal civil rights when the harassment is based on race, color, national origin, sex, or disability. When the behavior is serious enough that it creates a hostile environment, or when the harassment is encouraged, tolerated, not adequately addressed, or altogether ignored. And we know that, right? We understand, sort of our basic civil rights. But it's so important that we consider it when we're addressing our policies, right? Especially, and we never want to say it this way, but I've been involved in some districts and school sites who have been sued, right? Lawsuits have been brought against them from parents or community members when students' civil rights have been violated. So important to understand what that means. For California specifically, we have what we call is Seth's Law. Seth's Law was named after a 12-year-old middle schooler named Seth Walsh from Tehachapi, California, who took his own life due to relentless bullying from his school site, or at his school. And so from that came Seth's Law. And basically what Seth's Law says is that beginning July of 2012, school districts are now required to adopt a strong anti-bullying policy and to publicize a process and a timeline for addressing and investigating every incident of bullying. You must also list support resources for youth involved in bullying issues. And we understand that many school districts or school sites don't have counselors, right? Other than maybe like academic counselors, but mental health counselors are even more of a rare commodity now, right? Don't have social workers, right? They don't have on-site resources. As it relates to this law, all it says is that you have to have a list of support resources. That could be your county office. We're a support resource. We can help link you to behavioral health, mental health, outside counseling agencies, right, that can provide these resources for students that can come into your district or your school site. Any questions about Seth's law? If anything, I would encourage you to, how many of you know that you have an anti-bullying policy in your district or your school site? How many of you know exactly what it says? You understand it, it's very clear, you are reminded of it. Even less of us, right? So I would encourage you to look that up, to look up what your policy is and to question whether or not it encompasses a lot of what you're hearing about today. Does it cover our students? Does it protect us as a school entity? But more importantly, does it protect us as people, right? Does it protect our students? Does it protect us as teachers and educators? So just some, I think we covered a lot of these, but more misdirections around bullying prevention. And the reason why it's so important that I talk about these is because I still have many people who call and say, Patty, can you come do an assembly at our school site? Can you come talk to the kids? And my answer is always the same. Well, I can, but it might hurt you more than it's going to help you. And why do you think that is? Why do you think I'm so reluctant to come and talk to your school individually and do an assembly? Yeah.
If they don't have any kind of program, a one-day talk isn't going to make a difference, right?
Right. Or resources. Do you actually have a solid foundation for what bullying is? And what happens, we go and do an assembly and things might be great for about a week. But then they will either get worse or just go back to normal because we actually didn't do anything to change behavior. We didn't do anything to teach kids why they should change their behaviors. And therefore, your assembly was just a cosmetic solution, right? It was just a simple, short-term solution where we talked about how bad bullying is, we signed a pledge, and we're done. And then they see, more importantly, students see adults go back to the same behaviors, right? And so therefore, we've done more harm than good. Absolutely. So did you have a question?
Well, my question is,
Yeah.
We've had, our PTA wanted to have this one bang bullying solution. And you
Yeah.
said, absolutely not. We wanted to stay with our PBS program.
Yes.
That's what the teacher said, because we all have the same language.
Right.
Expected behaviors, no matter where you are in the school. And none of us knew why we wanted to keep the PBS system involved. But we knew that the one Band-Aid approach wasn't going to work. So now
Yeah.
I can go back to my leadership team and explain why.
Yes. And here's the other thing. If you feel like you have a great system, like PBIS is working great, you have a solid understanding, you have a system for addressing unwanted behaviors, and you've already talked about bullying, then an assembly might be great as a reminder for students, right? It's when we don't have anything and we just one day say, let's talk about bullying. And kids know, particularly like middle and high school, and they're just like, I've seen kids roll their eyes at those kinds of things when I'm on campus sometimes, right? Because they know that it's just a cosmetic thing and that the next day everything's gonna go back to normal and no one's actually gonna help me with my situation that I'm going through right now. Because the kid that's been bullying me for a year just signed the pledge. And that's the reality. Right? Absolutely. And here's the other thing about bullying prevention work is that, you know, we want to focus on what we're trying to create instead of what we're trying to stop, right? And so like instead of like bullying, like let's focus on kindness and compassion and inclusion and acceptance, right? Because otherwise all kids hear about is bullying, right? And it just becomes this like hot, you know, word. And so we want to try and spin that. So again, absolutely, those simple short-term solutions, group treatment for children who display bullying behaviors. Obviously, I know none of you would ever do that, but I still have to say that, right? We never want to put kids together that have been displaying bullying behaviors. Why wouldn't we do that?
They learn from each other.
They're going to feed off of each other, right? They're going to learn new and improved ways to hurt others, unfortunately, right, for some of them. Anger management or self-esteem enhancement for children who bully, that doesn't work, right? Because we know that for some students who display those bullying behaviors, we know that it could be part of an anger issue. But what I find most of all is that our students who display bullying behaviors, they're quite charming and charismatic and sort of fly under the radar, right? They know how to talk to adults, right? I would never do that. I wasn't over there, right? So they're very, very socially skilled at knowing how to talk to adults and getting out of sticky situations, right? And to me, that implies that they have a very high self-esteem. I think very highly of myself, right? So we would never want to give them self-esteem enhancement, right? And that sounds awful, but we know what we mean, right? We understand a healthy self-esteem versus a not so healthy. We know that zero tolerance policies don't help, right? That's not what we want here. Do we say we don't accept whatever those behaviors are, right? If you're using, you know, being safe, being respectful, being responsible, are you going back to those school expectations and those core values? Are you saying, you know, what you did, it wasn't being respectful? You know, it's not my rule, right? It's not, I'm not saying that. We, here at our school, we don't do whatever it is, right? And so we put it back on the expectations. But again, you have to have a solid understanding of what those expectations are if we're gonna throw them out, right, to our students and our parents, for sure. Again, selecting inappropriate materials, and then mediation and conflict resolution to resolve bullying issues. Knowing what you know already, why might that not work? If there's a real bullying situation, why would conflict resolution not work?
Wait, we're saying conflict resolution where the bully and the child that's getting bullied have to be together in the same room?
Yeah.
It just seems like it's, maybe they'll pretend like nothing's happening, but then it just seems like after that session, like
Yeah.
maybe the bully might have some aggression to let out because of the situation.
Yeah.
Because of that.
And and the real danger is that we've now re-victimized that student all over again. Now, conflict resolution can be a great model if there's been intensive, therapeutic, restorative work that's already happened with both parties, where they've both agreed to respect each other during this conflict resolution. But to say, let's just put them in a room so they can work it out, right, is a huge no-no, right? Because we just run the risk of really re-victimizing the student or students who have been victimized already, right? So we would never want to do that, for sure.
It also seemed like it sets up that there's a blame component.
Absolutely.
The kid who was bullied.
Yeah, like what did you do to get yourself in this situation that now you have to, yeah, absolutely. Good point. And I think I'm frozen here, but let's see. Okay, so let's get into some prevention strategies because we've got just about 15, 20 minutes left, I believe. So, oh, by the way, what is wrong with this picture? It's a little dark, but can you see it? Can you tell me what's wrong with this picture?
Sounds like they're emphasizing bullying.
We're gonna have a bullying kickoff. This is a real thing, like the school really did this. So again, if I already mentioned, you know, instead of bullying, let's like focus on like kindness and acceptance, right? But if you must use the word bullying, at least, you know, try to put like anti or prevention in front of it, or after it, right? For sure. But let's talk a little bit about what prevention looks like. So I think most of us are familiar with that tiered approach, right? PBIS, right? Or MTSS, whatever you have at your particular school sites that helps you align what your supports for all of our students. And so just a quick reminder, what we say at the primary or universal prevention, it might also be called tier 1 supports. This is for all of our students, right? All of our students. But we know that only about 80 to 85% of your students will buy into that they will get those supports and that it'll work well for them. These are things like PBIS, bullying prevention within positive behavior support, right? Bullying prevention within PBIS. There's another program called Stand for Courage that we really like, and it was collaborated on by the same developers out of Oregon for PBIS, Stand for Courage, and then Oveus, which is the program that I'm certified in. The reason we like Oveus also is that very much like Stand for Courage, it's a comprehensive approach to bullying prevention. So it's not like all on the teachers or all on the administrators. It has a school component, a parent component, and a community component, so that we're sort of all in it together. So that's sort of at the primary. But we know that about 10 to 15% of our students will need a tier 2 support. They will need a secondary support, right? And these are things like check in, check out, right? That we use as a tier 2 support, particularly within PBIS. Check in, check out, targeted social skills instruction. I was at a school a few years back and we did Recess Academy, where it was literally teaching basic social skills to students during their recess period. And we didn't take all of the break because we understood it was important for them to go out. But we were keeping them in. It could be 5 to 10 minutes of Recess Academy, and it was about how do we raise our hand? We don't raise our hand and then speak, right? We raise our hand and we wait for the teacher to call on us. It seems silly, but kids really need to be taught that, right? We need to teach behaviors much like we do academics, right? We just have to, because we can no longer assume that our kids are coming to us knowing how to do these things. Peer reinforcement strategies. And then we know that even after all of that, we might still have that 3 to 5% of our student body that needs a more intense intervention or support, right? And that's at the tier 3 level. This is intense function-based support, wraparound, centered planning. This is a family circle, right? We're having the family come in. I mean, this can be your SST or an IEP meeting, but it's done maybe in a circle in a more restorative way. And we also have to consider the language that we're using in there, right? Are we saying, you know, we love Johnny or Susie or Jose. We love them and we're worried about them because, and you're gonna have all the evidence, right? Because they've now shown all of these behaviors and we're worried about them, right? So that's just a snapshot of what that continuum can look like in terms of bullying prevention. These are just some of the similarities that I want you to see when you're talking about bullying prevention and school-wide PBIS. It requires the same components. If you are considering implementing bullying prevention specifically and you have PBIS, you're not creating a whole separate team. That's it. That's the team. That's the leaders of the work, right? I know, I apologize, this slide is a little bit difficult to see, probably particularly for our virtual participants, but I just wanted to show another similarity between PBIS and the Oveus Bullying Prevention Program, and how it works on the individual, the school, the community level, and then the parents, of course, are at the center of that. They need to be, there are stakeholders, and they're sort of at the center of that work as well. I know I'm going a little bit fast here, you guys, but I want to make sure we leave just a few minutes for any last minute questions. But just also looking at bullying prevention, you know, for all versus the individual student supports, how we're using and collecting that data. That's a huge issue in the area of bullying in general, and I'm going to mention that in just a little bit. We want to recognize stand-up behavior, right? And so getting students to buy into an intervention is really half the battle, right? A student should be involved in every phase of prevention when implementing any program. Again, there are more of them than there are of us. So we need to make them our allies, and we need to ask them what they think would work for them, right? And involve your students. And I already talked about, you know, really flipping that language and going from bullying to focusing on kindness, right? So this is an area that we are really struggling with because we don't have, particularly in Santa Clara County, we don't have a representative sample of bullying specific data for Santa Clara County. How many of you conduct the CHICS, the California Healthy Kids Survey? So that survey, and the reason why we encourage your districts to take that survey is because it has bullying specific questions. It has questions that clearly relate to their perception of safety on school campus. And so we really encourage people to take it because currently we don't have, again, a representative sample of data for Santa Clara County. So we really don't have an idea of the degree of bullying incidents within Santa Clara County. But we're working on it. I'm working on it. I'm trying to gather as much data as we can so that we can really understand the problem as it relates to our county.
Just a quick comment on that.
Yeah.
One of the things we're noticing in our district, and I'm in Oxnard, a decrease in student participation because they have to have parent approval to take the survey. And over the last few years, we're noticing fewer parents are providing permission for their.
Or they're opting out.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm not sure in your area, but I know for us, there's a lot of reasons why our districts don't do the California Healthy Kids Survey, but we have a team that can come out and they do, you know, they could talk to parents, they can talk to staff. There's monies available for districts to take the survey. There are,
That was the question that came up. Is
yeah.
We're seeing this decline, so what do we do
Right.
to boost it back up?
Yeah, right. So I think it's part of it is also to figure out why. Do we know why parents are opting out of it? Is there a fear around it? Is there a concern? What is it, right? Because right now, if we don't know, we're just assuming, right? And we don't want to do that. We want to ask them, you know, and we want to make it very clear what that survey would do, and then try and work through some of those concerns. So very important to survey your students and your staff. Also, how adults respond is so important. You should have a clear, a formal way that all of the adults on your campus address bullying behavior, right? Or any unwanted behavior. And the first thing we want to do absolutely is let the students know that their report is important, right? Even if you as an adult don't know exactly what to do, we all have the ability to say, thank you so much for telling me. You're so brave. And I'm so proud that you came to me. And we're gonna figure this out together. Again, time and time again, kids, they don't care. that you have the right answer right away. They don't care about that. They care that you've listened and that you care about them, right? Just another sort of on-the-spot intervention that can be used as a teachable moment. I'm not going to go super in detail. My room monitor is really good about her time, and she's telling me I have less than 10 minutes. But this is an on-the-spot intervention, and of course, this only works with things we can see, right? I get that. But it really helps particularly for our campus supervisors, our yard supervisors, our staff that does yard duty. Really can help, because then kids see that you're having a uniform response to these unwanted behaviors. Back in the county that I was in before I came to Santa Clara, we did do a really good job of surveying all of our schools, and one of the things that came up for us was that there was a question that we asked staff about how often do you intervene when you see bullying behaviors with students? And over 80% of staff said all the time, all the time. Then we asked students, how often do the adults at your school intervene when they see bullying behaviors? And it was less than 15%. Huge discrepancy in that data, right? Because for our students, their perception is the adults here don't intervene. And therefore the message is you don't care. But we know that that's not true, right? But we have to realize that for many of our students, perception is reality. And if they don't see you taking an active part and trying to stop unwanted behaviors, then we get some of that diminished empathy, the guilt, right? The things that we talked about already. So having things like this for your staff is so important. It's just a tool, right? It's one more tool. Very busy slide, I know. I just wanted to share resources of what other folks are doing, but this is sort of a how to determine, disruptive or violent behavior, and this is a chart of consequences, right? So you start with, is it physical, is it emotional, is it cyberbullying, is it social, and then taking it all the way down to what is this? Is this something teachers can handle on their own? Is this clear bullying that needs to be documented? Is this a Title IX violation, right? Is this a violation of the 504 plan, or is this criminal behavior, right? So just a, and again, you have access to this. Our teaching matrix. If you're a PBIS school site, you should, right, already have something similar, right? Where you have this sort of teaching expectations. All you do to add something specific about bullying prevention is you add a column about what to do when you see disrespect. So when you see disrespect in the cafeteria, what do you do? When you see disrespect out on the playground, in your classroom, what do you do, right? Simple as that, just adding a column. And again, you have access to this in your in the PowerPoint. Just another way to look at the continuum of bullying prevention, as well as school-wide PBIS practices. Many of the things we already talked about, but I offer other supports as well. Peacekeeping circles, morning meetings, class circle, whatever you call them. Many of you are already doing them. They're all the same thing, right? It's about building relationships and having your students understand that you do care about them, right? That you know them, that you listen to them, you see them. So you can kind of go through that prevention, early intervention, intensive, and the similarities with PBIS. And many of you already have a lot of these things in place. You do. You just sort of have to align them, fill in the gaps, and then making them specific, right, around bullying behaviors, knowing what you know now. You also got access to this self-assessment. I'm not sure if I linked the checklist, but I can upload. Okay, great. So the self-assessment is great because if you can take that with either by yourself or with your PBIS team, your school climate leadership team, whoever that is on your campus, to really see if you are ready to implement bullying prevention or to just add it, right? It's not a separate thing. You're just adding it to your already existing system. this quick assessment kind of gives you a good idea of sort of where you're at. Any questions about it? Some other, so pbis.org also has a lot of free online resources for effective implementation. A lot of information, a lot of resources for you to check out there. I know it was kind of fast, guys, but I just want to remind you that, you know, stopping bullying kind of seems like, oh, it's never going to end, but we can make a difference, right? But that transformation does require some healthy struggle, right, which you're already doing. This is my information, guys. I welcome any questions. I know we only probably have like a minute left. If there are any questions right now, if not, my cards are in the back. Please email me or call me. Is there a question in the back? Are you stretching? Yeah. Thank you guys so much. Please remember to fill out your evaluations. I believe they're digitally or on the app. Thank you guys so much.